going to get started soon. The chat room is open, so please do use it. Say hello. Let us know where you're watching from, and we will get started in about a minute. Hello, 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 and welcome, and thank you for joining us. It looks like we have an audience from all over the world, so thank you. I know, depending on where you are in the world, it is a lovely spring day here in Ontario. I hope the weather is great for you wherever you are, and we are so excited for tonight's event. So before we get started, I just have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. And just ignore my cat, she likes to chat. And then we're going to get going. So the first thing I would like to do is I'd love to say a big thank you to Mackenzie from Simon & Schuster Canada for all of her help in making this event happen. I would like to thank Idea Exchange for partnering up with Romance by the Book, our blog, for tonight's event. I'd like to say a big thank you to Genevieve for taking time out of her very busy schedule to join us and talk about her latest book, Bluebird. We are so excited to chat with her. If you are having any problems on Zoom, if you all of a sudden can't hear, if you can't see, my best advice to you is to hop out of Zoom and to hop back in again. If it's still not working, you can send myself, Ronnie, or Gabrielle a private chat, and we'll help you out as fast as we can. Throughout this talk tonight, I'm sure books are going to be talked about, and I will write down any book titles and authors that Genevieve and Kayleigh talk about tonight, so you don't have to worry about frantically writing it down. And if you're watching on Zoom, I will send out an email afterwards with that nice book list for you and any kind of resources or anything that they talk about. So I'll keep track of that, so you don't have to worry about that. Near the end of the event, we will have a live Q&A session with Genevieve. You can submit your questions 3 ways. If you're watching on Zoom, you can use the chat or the Q&A section. If you're watching on Facebook, you can just put your questions in the comment section and I will bring them over to Zoom. So you don't have to worry. I will grab your questions if you're watching from Facebook. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of Bluebird, Wordsworth Books is our official bookseller for tonight. I will put their information in the chat room and on Facebook. Do check out their website. If you're not from our area, you can go to your local bookstore and purchase it. I know those local independent bookstores sure do appreciate all of your business. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Kayleigh Platz, who is one of the bloggers at Romance by the Book. Kayleigh is a lifetime writer and avid reader who is passionate about library advocacy. She spends her days writing about people far smarter than herself for the Institute of Quantum Computing. At night, she tells stories to her cat. Hopefully one day, other people will read those stories as well. Thank you, Kayleigh, for joining us.
Thank you, Ronnie. I am so excited. What we're going to do tonight is I'm going to bring Genevieve onto the screen and introduce her. and then we are going to just get right into it. Hi, Genevieve.
Hi, Kayleigh.
So I'm going to read your official bio just in case people don't know about you. Genevieve is the USA Today and #1 best-selling author of The Forgotten Home Child, Letters Across the Sea, Tides of Honor, Promise to Keep, Come From Away, and At the Mountain's Edge. Her newest book, as a side note, Bluebird, which just came out this week, was an instant bestseller in Canada, which we're going to get talking about a little later. But Genevieve is passionate about breathing life into Canadian history through tales of love and adventure. Welcome.
Thank you, Kayleigh.
So we are going to talk about Bluebird. We're going to talk about your writing life. We need to do a toast. We should have planned this because,
Yes.
so congratulations. Can I just start with that?
Thank you. You know what? That was so amazing to see that. My publicist, Mackenzie, who is the best publicist in the universe, and my editor, Sarah, both messaged me right away, and they said instant bestseller, and that happened the day after it came out. What? It was amazing, and it all happens because of readers. A lot of it came from pre-orders, and I thank every one of you who pre-ordered the book. Thank you so much. And sales on the first day, I didn't know that was possible to get on the list after one day. So I am deliriously happy and grateful to everybody.
So proud, so excited. I'm just so excited it's getting into people's hands. So before we get any further, do you want to tell us a little bit about Bluebird?
Yes. Bluebird is, I think what happened was I wanted to write about prohibition and rum running and bootleggers. I wanted to write about it ever since I first moved to Nova Scotia. And I know Nova Scotians will laugh when they hear this because a lot of them said to me, oh, you got to write about that because so many people in my family were involved in rum running. And, you know, they would say my great uncle was a bootlegger, and everybody seemed to have somebody in their family that did it. So I wanted to write about prohibition for a while. And then I started to think about Windsor, and it started growing and growing. And then I started watching Peaky Blinders. So I thought, okay, now's the time, I'm gonna write it. So what I did was I went back to World War I, and I learned about the Canadian nursing sisters. It was the only job that women in Canada were allowed to do overseas during the war, was to be a nurse. Originally it was a nursing sister, but they didn't have enough nuns, so they had to open it up to the other ladies. And actually over the war, there ended up being almost 3,000 of the Canadian war sisters, so or nursing sisters. So I opened up with her. Her name is Adele, and Adele is one of the nurses. And of course, they wore these very distinctive robin's egg blue gowns under their aprons. And the soldiers would call them Bluebirds very affectionately. So I knew from the beginning that was going to be the name of the book, and it works perfectly. Anyway, she meets up with Jerry Bailey and his brother John, because Jerry is injured doing what he does, which is being a tunneler for the army. And that meant they would fight underground, like sometimes 100 feet underground. Craziness, and we can talk about that later. Yeah. And so they meet. There's sparks are flying all over the place, and they hope, you know, quietly, because this is World War I, and we're not throwing ourselves at each other in World War I times. They were hoping that they might meet again, and they discover they're both from the Windsor area. And so after a long war and everything, and getting back to life as usual, one day they run into each other. And Jerry has dealt with coming back from the war and joining society by joining the Bootleggers and running a very successful still in business and becoming one of the gangsters that are running Windsor and Detroit and all of that. And I had so much fun writing it. So it was, that's sort of a really big nutshell of what the book is.
There are so many things we're going to talk about tonight. We won't give any spoilers, or we'll try not to give away too much of the big kind of plot points at the end there. One thing I do have to ask about, though, is you actually have a dual timeline in this book, yes, which I know you've played with in other books before, but this one felt like it was a bigger part of the thrust of the story, I guess.
Yes, and initially I hadn't thought I would do this. I was working on the historical part of the book. That's kind of my baby. I love to write the history, and that's all I expected to do. But then I was reading a story in the New York Post, I believe it was, about a gentleman who is on Instagram as, I think it's Bootlegger Bungalow, I think. And he and his partner had bought a house in rural New York that apparently was built by a rum runner 100 years ago. And so they wanted to renovate the whole house. And when they started pulling off the rotten boards on the outside, they revealed 100-year-old whiskey bottles. And reading this, I thought, oh, well, there is a wonderful way to tie the past and the present together. And then when I brought Adele into the story, Adele has some very interesting family, stories going back. And I was able to, I think of this as one of my first kind of mysteries. I don't think of my books as having mysteries in them, but this one felt more like a mystery. And it was really fun to do it. So yeah, I don't always want to either write or read dual timelines, but when they work, they work. And this one was fun.
I feel like it tied everything up so great at the end. Like it really pushed the end to that like really satisfying conclusion.
Yes, and it's hard because when you're writing both, it's like writing two books, really, two books in one. And sometimes when I'm writing one, I don't want to stop and start writing the other one. And when it gets to the end of the book and you'll find out how it ends, whether it's in past or present, I didn't want to let one of them go to jump into the other. That was hard. I mean, I miss my stories all the time when I'm done, but when I'm writing them, it's hard too.
And I'm going to go back in time. Do you write Adele and Jerry and then Cassie, or did you kind of work it as it needed? I guess I got more into the plot and the structure than.
Well, I mostly did Jerry and Adele first. I was really wanting to tell that story primarily. And then when I read that New York Post story, I thought, okay, I see how I can wind through it. So it was like writing two separate books and kind of winding them together. It's a very interesting process, and it's not an easy process, because just to make them tie into a story it has to make both stories interesting. It's not just one supporting the other. They have to work together, and that can be hard sometimes.
I laughed when you said, in Halifax, someone always had someone from a bootlegging family. I found out this past week, I was visiting my great uncle, and when my great grandfather moved to this country, he moved to Riverside outside of Windsor. And that's where my great uncle and my grandfather grew up. And my great grandfather was a rum runner. And my great uncle was a boat. He built bottle ships. He was a big sailor. And so he had all these stories about these boats.
Yes.
That were used to go across the river and take alcohol from Canada to the States. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more, because you talk about what these people did back in the late teens and early 20s to mod these cars and boats. And my uncle was saying, like, these things were freaking amazing, and they'd still be like amazing today.
Yes, they're fantastic. And yeah, the same sorts of things that they did for cars, they did for boats. So I can sort of talk about both. But the boats, they did the most ingenious ways to hide this booze. And the funny thing was, they didn't have to hide it from the Canadian forces. Like the Canadian people, the border guys, they didn't really care if they were going to take their stuff across to the US, because that was legal. As long as they paid their export tax, then that was fine. So they didn't have to hide it from them. But the Americans did not want them coming in, and they had their juiced up boats, and they had their own ways of hiding in the weeds and waiting for these to come through. But they were just geniuses with being sneaky. The word bootlegger comes from, they used to put the booze in their boots and walk around with it. And they would have, with the boats, I know there was one of my favorites was that they would have the booze tied up along the sides of the boats, and they would be taking it across. And if they saw the police coming, they would cut the rope, and all the booze would sink. But it was anchored to the bottom by a chunk of salt. And over time, the salt would dissolve and it would come right back up, and they could go and collect it and get back on their way. They they worked with old warships that were really fast and strong, and they had guns on the front, and it was really violent. And the cars, you can read in the story about how they would hide them under the seats or under the running boards and in the ceiling, and it was amazing. There was a story about someone who crossed the bridge later on or actually crossing the ice with eggs, and they had put the booze inside the shells. It's amazing what they did.
And that was based on that was a real thing.
Yes.
I know Krista in the chat said that that's one of her favorite parts too.
It's true. I had to read that. I had to look into it. But I guess it's like when I was a little kid and we were dyeing Easter eggs and you have to blow out the yolk first. And I guess they just kind of tape it. I don't know. But I thought that was a neat example.
Something for us to try when we're bored or something.
Yeah. You need to bring a whiskey somewhere. Just
put it in. It does. I'm agreeing, like, how much work that would have been, though. You think, like, 12 eggs wouldn't have got a lot of whiskey, but someone put that time and energy.
But I think that part of it was part of the fun.
Yeah.
You know, I think these guys, it was more than just getting booze over and making a lot of money. These people made a ton of money, but I think it turned into a challenge and a lot of fun for them. So the more outlandish, the better.
Now, there's something I wanted to talk about because I think I can see some chat, Lori, and other people are talking about how you always bring interesting insights into Canadian history that we don't always know about. But something that you talked about in this book, which, you know, spans beyond Canadian history, is what the soldiers and the nurses experienced coming back home. And it really made me think, because when they left for the war, you know, let's say they left in 1914, the world was a very different place. Women had very different roles. I mean, clothing was different. Cars weren't as accessible. The rules of society were dramatically different when they landed. And they landed into a world that wasn't so friendly for them, which kind of always shocks me when you bring that up in books, because that's not, you know, that's something that we hear about a lot of our returning home soldiers and nurses.
Yeah, you don't expect that kind of, I don't know, ignorance and abuse of veterans after all that. But these people come back with a world of thoughts and memories and nightmares that they don't know what to do with them. They get back into society and have to try and fit in. I think pretty much all of my books bring PTSD into it in some way, but this was the first time I was able to really show it in a woman, from a woman's perspective. And she was there to, all of the nursing sisters, the Bluebirds, were there, both as medical nurses, but also as compassionate, you know, partners, helpers for these poor men that had been through hell. And so it was interesting going through her perspective, because I started looking for a lot of quotes from the nurses of the time. It's when I can run across journals, or sometimes people will write stories about their episodes down there, and I looked and I could find tons of stuff from the soldiers and the, you know, pilots and everything. Very little from the nurses. And at one point, there was a letter apparently sent out to all of them, like 2,700 of them or something, asking for them to please submit something, a memory or a thought, or, you know, anything that they could to share about this. And they got, I think they could maybe get a dozen short replies. It's a female thing, I guess, or I don't know if it's now, but back then, you know, women were much more introspective. And I think they also worried more about, they'd spent the whole war helping these men and holding their secrets and keeping them safe. And it didn't feel right to them. This is what I'm hypothesizing. It didn't feel right to open up these stories and share these men's past with people. So I don't know, but it's kind of like Canadian history as a whole, right? We just don't talk about ourselves.
Yeah.
It's interesting that way.
And something I found really interesting that Adele tackles with is not that she was coming home expecting to be received as a hero, but she almost gets shunned in certain parts of society for having worked in the war.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that really surprised me.
Yeah, and I think you're referring mostly to her sister's husband.
Yeah.
And his was a very prevalent reaction. Number one, women are not supposed to be working. You should not be out there doing a job. Number two, you should never be in a war. You should not be close to anything that's violent or dirty. Or I even watched something where I can't remember which one it was that I was watching, that they said, how could a woman ever marry a man after seeing them naked and damaged and bleeding? And a good woman should never want to be that near that. And it was just basically, we were fragile little pieces of china, and we should not be anywhere near all that. And I think that must have been really, really hard for someone like Adele, who would have gone over there and dropped all of those female, ideas, and became the hardest working person that she could be, not a woman, but a person. And I think that must have been very hard to be regarded that way.
And I feel like that's part of that whole changing of the time that was happening, of, coming back into the roaring 20s and having that friction.
What a time that must have been, right? Because I think when Jerry came back, one of them made a comment about the hemlines coming up and the necklines going down. And it's all of a sudden these people were free. And I think about the men and the women coming back who had been through all of this, being exposed to all of a sudden color and music and like people laughing and having so much fun. The 20s just came out of the worst time and made the best of it. And I love visualizing the difference between the two. Like when I look at Jerry and his brother John working in the tunnels, working in these little tunnels that were like 3 or 4 feet wide at their widest, and maybe 4 feet tall, sometimes ankle deep in water, living in the dark, carrying, candles so they could see, or just walking in the dark. And then
With no sound. Yeah.
and then coming home to lights, lights, camera, action, everything was going. And it was a really neat change to be able to research and write about.
And I'm going to switch us over to Jerry and John and the tunneling, because the tunneling, I mean, there's so many brutal things in World War I, and there's so many brutal stories. And tunneling obviously has a lot of symbolism in this book and comes back to play different roles in the story. Can you tell me a little bit more about how Jerry and John became tunnelers for you and why?
Yeah, well, they started out in my book when I first started. They were with the Army. They were regular soldiers. That's where I started them out in trench warfare. And then I thought, no, I need something new. I want to learn something new. And well, to be perfectly honest, that's when I started watching Peaky Blinders. And if you watch the show, Tommy Shelby was a tunneler. And I thought, what is a tunneler? I need to know what that is. And I started researching more and more into it and being aghast at what these men did, digging 100 feet underground in the dark to possibly run into the enemy soldiers and then blow up trenches from underneath. This craziness. And then I thought, I wonder if there were any Canadians doing that. And we had 3 Canadian battalions doing that. Most of them came from mining mines. And I did stretch the fiction a little bit there because I couldn't find the right kind of mine that would have been close to where Jerry was living. But the 3 Canadian battalions were, there were all different nationalities of them. And it struck me as interesting that we don't know anything about that. We know so much about World War I now, but nobody ever talks about that. And I love coming across something new like that and being able to talk about it and say, it's not like saying, well, they lived in the trenches with the rats and everything. And we've heard those, we know that, and not to put anything down about it, but I want something new. And so the tunnelers to me were amazing. And yeah, it was pretty symbolic because they were, when they got home, they would feel these claustrophobic memories coming back, and it would hold them in place and not let them move at all until they could find some kind of light to go towards. And then they dig another tunnel later on in the story, and it all comes from their experience. And I found it very, very interesting to talk about that aspect of what the men went through.
And I feel like in a way it's almost your hallmark of uncovering these hidden gems of Canadian history and breathing life into them.
Isn't it crazy the amount of Canadian stories that I've been able to find in, I think I started doing this in 2014. So this is my 7th book about Canadian history in 7 years. And I still have so many more stories to talk about. And how come we don't know about them? How come we aren't taught about so many things? The Forgotten Home Child with the British home children, with 4 million descendants, most of whom don't know anything about their ancestors. Letters Across the Sea with the POWs in Hong Kong after the Battle of Hong Kong and what they went through and how they came home to absolutely no recognition from Canadians. Even the Halifax explosion is not spoken about anymore, even though it's just past its 100th anniversary. So the Klondike Gold Rush, so many amazing parts of Canadian history. I'm not a historian. I hated history. I was so bored in high school. I slept through everything. And then I started reading historical fiction. And all of a sudden I thought, well, now history is interesting. Look at that. And then when I learned, well, the first one I learned about of Canadian history that I'd never heard of was the explosion. And I thought, okay, let's dig into Canadian history and see what we have. And I love being able to open people's eyes to these things and help people see our country in a different light. And not everything we did was bad. Not everything we did was good, but it all needs to be talked about and shown. And I feel incredibly fortunate to be doing what I'm doing.
And there's a couple other things that there's so much that we can talk about in Bluebird. We do have to talk about your stunning cover as well. We'll get to that. But 2 things. One, I love seeing teachers talk about bringing your books into the classroom in high school. That fills me with joy of hoping that there's maybe less kids sleeping through history class. And 2, you touch on some other interesting Canadian history in Bluebird, specifically a bit about the railroad porters.
Yes.
And you also talk about war-amps. And the porters, I feel like, have oddly become a timely thing
Yes.
in Canadian history.
Yes, and isn't there like a musical on TV about it or something?
I saw a commercial for a TV show or something as well.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find it yet, but I want to watch that. A fascinating part of history about these men who were not paid. They were not given anything, just the responsibilities of helping these passengers, and all they lived on was tips, and they never really got to see their families because they were constantly just putting all their hearts into working for tips. And Adele reaches into her purse and pulls out a dime because that was sort of the currency, but she had no idea that was so valuable to these men. And to have them all called George, which is after George Pullman, because it was his railway line that they worked for, to have these men reduced to the name George. All of them were George.
Oh, their name. And just to clarify, these are all Black men.
Oh, sorry, yes.
I don't know if we talked about that, but just in case people hadn't read the book or don't know what we're talking about, these are all Black men who acted as porters in the trains. And yeah, they were all like, their identity was taken away. They were not paid.
And I think the musical that you and I were seeing the ads for, I think that's about when they formed a union. And they were able to start working things out. But what a life. That was terrible. And I wanted to get back to when you talked about the schools, because that is my dream. That is my ultimate dream, is to get all these books into high school, because I've gotten letters back from people of all ages, but starting at probably age 16 all the way up to 92, telling me how much they've learned about our country. And it is my dream to get these books into high schools across the country. And I keep saying, when it's Christmas time or end of school year and your teachers, it's time to buy a teacher's gift, I think that they've had enough mugs and candles and they might like a book. So that's my plea to people when they're thinking about buying something for their kids' teachers at the end of the year, because I think it would really help. There wouldn't be people like me sleeping through hours and hours of talk about the War of 1812 and the fur trade. We've learned that already.
And just, I need to call out and thank Denise, who has let us know that the TV show is called The Porter and it's on CBC.
On CBC, great. I'm going to write that down.
Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you, Denise.
So I want to be respectful of time. It's 7:30. I'm going to chat. I have a ton more questions to talk with you about, but I am going to keep an eye on the Q&A. But I wanted to move a little bit away from some of the big themes and go into a little bit of, you always tackle families and sibling dynamics in a really interesting way. And there is 3 main groups of siblings in this book that have very different relationships. And I'm talking about our hero, Jerry, and his brother, John, Adele and her sister, Marie, and then I'm going to call him the villain of the story, although he would be the hero of his own story, Ernie, and his brother, Frank.
Yes. And then there's the present tense families too, but we don't need to go into that.
We won't go into that too much, but yes, that is, I was focused on my past 3.
Yes.
And I just wanted to talk a little bit. You play a lot with the bonds of family and sacrifice
Yes.
in this book. Those, I would say, are some of your main themes. Can you tell me a little bit about your family dynamics in this book? Because they're fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think through this, what I wanted to show was these characters, each one of them has such a distinct character arc, but they're influenced by the people in their families. Like John and Jerry have been inseparable their whole lives and they lean on each other. But once they're back from the war, they start to deal with reality in different ways. And John is kind of losing control and Jerry's trying to hang on to and keep him on the straight and narrow. And so it's families still trying to be together. Marie and Adele disagree on prohibition for a while and temperance union, but they love each other and they will work through it together. The story of Ernie Willoughby and his brother is a tragic one, but I think it's important to look at that story as well. It's not just the story of families who have the love that we all need and want in ourselves, in our own lives. There are families who are not, who do not raise their children the right way. And it ends up, all the intergenerational trauma that we learn about in other stories like The Forgotten Home Child, it came into here too, you know, that the boys' parents were not, we don't know why they were the way they were not kind. And it comes down to the boys. And it's just, I think we're learning a lot, not just about PTSD these days, but about this intergenerational trauma. I mean, everything we're learning about the residential school system and the home children and all that, we learned that. So I think for that, it was important. And I guess you can see it both ways because Jerry and John had very kind parents and they got that intergenerational non-trauma. So it's just important to have the relationships build through their character arcs. Every one of them has to have some kind of growth in their lives, whether it's better or worse. You can't have a straight line for a character. And I find it very intriguing to build one based on another and how one is moving. Jerry had to come into more of a role of authority when John started to, when the big brother started to lose it, the little brother had to step up. And I liked playing with the different growths between them all.
So I have 2 questions that come from that. And I can see a ton of questions coming up. So I'm going to ask my 2 questions and then we'll open it up to Q&A. My first question is your romance with Adele and Jerry. It is so sweet, but also sizzling. And I feel like it is a stronger romance that I've seen in some of your other, like you always have beautiful romances in your books, but this one, I don't know, there was just some sort of chemistry between these 2. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about their chemistry because it sizzled for me.
Thank you. That's very nice. Yeah, and I anyone who reads my books knows that I don't write sex and I don't write, gratuitous anything. And so it's kind of the relationships I write about, and I will always have a love story of some kind in my books because it's the emotion that helps you remember what you're learning. So when I have them, when they're in that position of learning from each other and growing from each other, but not going behind closed doors, then everything has to come from, their shared experiences. Adele and Jerry have well, they have a lot of shared experiences, having both been at the war and both of them being survivors, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And I think that they really learned that they needed each other. Um, I loved writing these two. I felt the same way. I felt that they were so real to me. I should tell you, when we're talking about them, Adele, her name came from one of my readers. Adele McLennan had once told me in a message that I should write about the Windsor Prohibition era. And so after I looked into that, I thought, well, that was good. And that name does show up in the census from the year. So I thought, okay, there's Adele. Jerry and John, that's my grandfather and his brother. So I used their names as well. And Bailey is because I love Baileys in my coffee.
I like it. Now, were your grandfathers involved in any sort of prohibition or rum running anywhere?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Not that I know of. Very, very stuffed collar, very tight. We don't talk about that. So I don't know.
So we'll just leave it as a maybe. How's that?
All right. He's there.
I have a few questions for you. The first one is one that I was actually already going to ask you. We're already talking about Bluebird, and readers are already going on what's next. Is there anything that you can tell us about your next story yet?
Of course, yes. I always have the next story is always in my head about 2 months before I'm finished the one I'm supposed to be focusing on. It's the plague of writers. It's that we've got too many stories going in our head. But I'm excited about this one too for 2023, spring of 2023, I hope. I'm going once again into roles in the war. This is World War II this time, of Canadians that we know little or nothing about. And so I started with something called, I ran across an article of the women who were called the listeners, who basically listened to the U-boats communicating and all the different Morse code that was flying around during World War II. And they were connected to Bletchley Park. And so the coders from here, from Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, they were sending things across to Bletchley Park. So they played a major role, but they all signed an oath of secrecy for 60 years on pain of death. And so these stories are just coming out, which is fantastic. The second thing that I loved learning about is called the Air Transport Authority, which was about the people who would fly in airplanes to replace ones that had been downed or damaged. And they originally had some of the World War I pilots flying them in, but they needed more because the war just kept going. And they started recruiting women to come and fly some of these planes. And there were not a lot of Canadian women in it, but there were some. These were amazingly heroic women. The other aspect I am planning on including in the book is a little about Camp X, which is our spy school. It's located, I believe, near Casa Loma, and it actually, Ian Fleming from 007 fame, he was there, and these people trained, these Canadians trained the French resistance fighters and recruited them, and again, they had an oath of secrecy, and I am loving finding out about what they were not allowed to tell us. So Camp X, very cool. And there's also a Camp X TV series from CBC as well, which was a lot of fun. I wish it had more seasons. It was a lot of fun.
Now, I think I ask you this every time, but so I'm backing up. There was a point in the book where I actually had to put the book down, and I messaged you on Instagram and went, "Oh my God, Genevieve, you're killing me. I need to catch my breath." And then I picked the book up and finished it, and had to calm myself down.
Sorry.
Thank you. It was fabulous. It was good. I remember we talked and you were like, "Kayleigh, this book, it's a little different. I mean, we know it's Peaky Blinders, very influenced. It's gritty. It's action-packed. Like you said, there's a mystery in it." Was there a point where you went, "Okay, this is where I'm writing, and this is where I have to go with the book, and I'm feeling uncomfortable"? I think as a writer, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but like, where is that feeling of comfort and pushing yourself and getting over your own imposter syndrome?
Is there a point? Is there a point when that is not happening? because I am constantly questioning what I'm doing. I wish that I was an organized writer. I'm not an organized person, so I'm not an organized writer. And so I come across so many different things and they're all exciting to me and I want to get everything included. And then I've got this amazing story with far too many things happening and I have to say, okay, focus. That's where I need to be and I'm way over there. So I need to focus, but it's hard to do that. And it's hard when you say imposter syndrome, it's very hard to trust that the book will be up to the standard that you want. You work and work and work on a book, and most of my books take me about 8 months, which is very fast.
And is that's the full book? Like what would a first draft take you?
Yes, well, probably I can write them really fast, like 6 weeks probably, and then I can, and at least part of it, at least like the first 40,000 words, and all my books are about 85,000. So I'll write the first 40,000 words and just to send it to my editor and say, so am I even close? And she and I will talk back and forth and she will try to set me back on the right track. But it's really, really hard. And I love my readers and I love the feedback that they give me and the messages I get. And the letters, somebody sent me a beautiful little pin of a bluebird before it came out. And it's just, I love my readers and the idea of letting them down when a new book comes out. I think, oh, I cannot release this book because it's not good enough. And I've always written for me first because I want to learn the history. But knowing that so many people are enjoying the books, I want to make sure that they are just right. And it's scary. It's like walking out on a stage the first time, and I don't know, but I'm absolutely thrilled that it's done what it's done already.
People are loving it so much. I loved it. I haven't stopped raving about it. So
I'm glad. I loved it. I was writing about it and saying, but I don't know if it's the right feel, because all my books feel different, don't they? They're all different, kind of almost not a different genre, but like if you look at it, At the Mountain's Edge, that's an adventure story, and Come From Away is more of a love story, and they're all different. And this one, again, going into Prohibition was a whole different slant on the history, but I'm so thrilled at the reception it's getting.
okay, something that we do have to talk about, and I've been seeing it coming up in the chat, is can we just comment and ooh and ah over your gorgeous cover?
Right?
I've already given my copy. I've lent my copy out already, so I can't hold it up. But can we just look at that? That is.
And look at the gold, like the copper. I don't even remember what that's called, but it's all in there.
The of it and
to open it up and see, oh, it's just so pretty over little gold or copper. It's beautiful. And I don't know if people generally know that authors have very little say on their covers. And I would say I'm in a very, very lucky position. I love my publisher, Simon & Schuster Canada. I love them so much. And they do give me great input. The overall idea of this cover came to me, and when the color popped onto my screen, I just thought, oh, wow. I learned a few things, which is maybe interesting to point out. The World War I and World War II books have, not all of them, but the ones I've been seeing, now that I've learned, have a little kind of a clue. If you look up here, you'll see a little biplane. Biplane equals World War I. And if there's a regular plane, that equals World War II. Isn't that interesting?
that is so interesting.
So that's what we were going with. And so we put the little biplane there. And I asked them to put in a Model T because of the bootleggers, the rum runners. And I also made sure that her hair was blonde because Adele was blonde. But I didn't need to change a thing, really. It was just so beautiful. And they always do that. They make the most beautiful covers for me. And yeah, I'm very lucky.
Oh, I've got, holy crow. We've got so many questions here. One question that we need to know is, what are you, like, if people have finished Bluebird, they're loving Bluebird, what are you reading right now? Like, what else are you recommending?
Oh, I read Natalie Jenner's The Bloomsbury Girls.
Okay, yes.
Love that. That was really, really sweet. I'm about to dive into Kate Quinn's Diamond Eye. I was, oh geez, there's so many that I've been reading. I've just been busy this week, and I can't even remember. I haven't picked up a book in a couple of weeks, but there are so many. Heather Marshall's looking for Jane. Everyone's talking about that book. That's an amazing book. Oh, I'll have to think of a list and get back to you on that.
You gave some good ones already.
Good, I'm glad.
I think we have a lot of chatter about your cover. People have noticed that you are actually wearing blue. I realized that was a missed opportunity on my side. So
it's exactly the right color, I think. So yeah. Yeah, I think so.
You matched it.
Yes.
So I'm scrolling through. Oh, this is a fun question. We talked a lot about your characters. Did you have a character that was difficult to write that didn't behave on the page? And did you have a character that just kind of was easy and flowed out in Bluebird?
I would say Ernie Willoughby was a bit of a challenge to me.
Yeah.
So if you haven't read the book, he is sort of the anti-hero. He's a rough guy, but he's like the head mobster of town, and he's the big what would you call him? Big kahuna. He's the guy in charge.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with him.
And it's when you have somebody like that, it's so easy to write a stereotypical bad guy. And that's the easy way out. But he had to have a story. It's like in The Home Child when you want to despise these people that were the masters of the children, but then you need to know why they behaved the way they did. Why was Ernie Willoughby such a difficult person? And there had to be a story. So I had to walk away from the easy way out, which was he's just a bad, egotistical guy that runs the town. So he was very secretive. All my characters are usually pretty open with me. They talk a lot, just like I do. And he didn't. He was very close-lipped, and he was difficult to find for a little while, but I really like what he became. He had a different ending in my original book too, but this is the perfect ending the way it went.
And what about easy character? Was there a character that just...
You know, I love writing male characters for some reason. I find it's more colorful when I write men. I think because they go out there and they just do things. They don't analyze as much. I mean, it's not always the right thing to do, but they just do it. And I loved writing Jerry. And again, I was thinking about Tommy Shelby while I wrote it. I had to love him. So I loved writing Jerry's part a lot. And I did love Adele as well. But I find the girls harder to find. Yeah. I'm not sure why. It's like when I write the characters, the males, I can picture them too, but I can never picture what the females look like, and I don't understand that. But
your female characters are always delightful and strong and so fleshed out. So that's so interesting to hear, because I'd never know that.
Yeah, I love writing the men's. Like with Tides of Honor, I wrote Danny Baker's story, and that was all I wrote was Danny Baker's story until I submitted it to my editor back then, and she said, well, who is this girl? Because he's a pretty special guy, so she had to be, so go and find out who she is. And that's when I started digging into both sides, and wow, women are interesting too. But I think it's just fun. It's just easier to write men, and I can picture them doing these things, very physical. So it would be Jerry is my easiest.
I have a very random question for you. There is a little kitten in the field hospital that is kind of Adele's and her tent people's mascot, I guess?
Yes.
Is that based on, sometimes you base animals on real life stories, and I'm just curious if there was a field cat that has made its way in stories.
They did have them. There were random cats, right? They were all over the place, and there were a lot of rats and mice, and so these were very welcome animals to have. It's like in the trenches that the men did have dogs down there, and they did have, like, they were company for them. But yes, there were cats, and the general, they called him, because he was so secure and he was in charge, and he would come into the nurse's tent and sort of snuggle them all to sleep. I also wrote him because my two daughters had new cats, and I was learning for the first time in my life what it was like to live with cats, because I've been allergic and I've outgrown my allergies somehow, and now I'm experiencing cats for the first time, and I could see why he needed to be in the story. He was so lovable. He was perfect for what I needed.
He was a little bright light.
Little general. And there was there was a cat in British Home Children's Story as well. And that one, I don't know. They bring comfort, and I needed something a little bit special for them.
Yeah. Your animals always have such a great function in the books. Of course, I'm thinking of the dog that I still haven't forgiven you for. And oh my God, I just blanked on the title. I'm so focused on the dog.
With the, was it at the edge?
The Hong Kong, the Prisoners of War's dog.
Yeah. Yeah, those, that was Gander.
Gander, thank you. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he was a true hero, and he was based on reality. Like that dog grabbed a grenade and saved a dozen men's lives just by playing fetch. Like, he was an amazing hero. So there are heroes, and I couldn't do much about Gander's story.
I know, it was a real story.
But other than that, I've promised that I will never harm or kill an animal, unless it's a true story. And I will always end in either a happy or a hopeful way, because that's what I want to read. So those are my promises.
I'm scrolling through.
I love that everyone's writing questions.
There's so many questions. This is amazing. You guys are amazing. There's a few questions about places and different parts of Canadian history that people are wanting you to go look at again. But Mary shared something interesting, that Vietnam is where she first learned about like war tunnels, which is just interesting to remind us that there's so much of this all over the place. And something that is kind of a shared experience is also the Spanish flu plays a bit of a role in Bluebird, which, makes sense because of the time. Also very much sense because we are kind of living through our own pandemic 100 years later. Can you tell me a wee bit about that?
Of course I had to include that, right? Spanish flu was everywhere because we were talking about COVID all the time, and people were saying, well, 100 years ago they did this and this and this. And what I liked about including it, I had to include it, obviously. That was such an important thing. Millions and millions of people dying. But when I think about it after, I think what it says is that we came through that. Yeah. Yes, people died. It was a horrible, horrible time, just as COVID, but we survived. And, the human race, we're strong, and we can get through these things when we work together. And so I liked writing in the reality of what it was, but I liked showing people that, look, these people are still here. Not everybody died, and we can move forward and do things with our lives. I liked also talking about where the Spanish flu came from and how it went through all the soldiers, and then it spread all over the place. And you never expected it to hit a small town. No. And there it goes. It was everywhere.
Now, I know we are slowly running out of time. I think I have time for one or two more questions. But one, is we've talked a lot about your research, but where do you get your research from? Are you diving through newspapers, official documents? What is the Genevieve research plan?
I'm all over the place, just like my writing. But what I generally do is I know what point in history I want to write about, and I sort of think of that as a black and white photo, and it's something in the history. And I will go into the library and I'll pick up everything nonfiction and fiction that I can find, and I'll read through as much as I can before I start to nod off. I'll just get everything down for that black and white photo. And then I start going online and I'll look for people that specialize in things. Like, my favorite thing to talk about in this is that at one point I talk about Jerry and John going out into the woods, and I needed to know what they carried for a flashlight. And lo and behold, I found a website that is completely dedicated to the history of flashlights. And the guy that wrote to me about it was so passionate about it. And I get so many amazing things from these people who absolutely love that, whatever it is, point in history. It's fantastic. So a lot of what I get is, I do read off the archives. I'll go into the newspapers, and I'll go into, if I can find journals, that's just gold. Yeah. I did that with Promises to Keep. But if I just am dealing with these passionate people, a lot of the times they've already done all the work I need. I just need to go through and verify everything and make sure that it fits into the story. And the way the book is formed is from the research, because when I can see the research, when I understand it, I understand the time period, the politics and the food and everything like that, then I can understand the people that are emerging from it. And the characters start to tell me what to look into. Like, I like to talk about if they're walking along a street and they ask me, what am I looking at? And so I have to look, what would they be looking at? And what is in that store window? And does she need it? How much does it cost? You know, they tell me what they need. And that's how the research carries on for me.
Now my last, I love it. I love the partnership with your characters because, I mean, especially there's so much vivid food and clothing and the
general attitude.
Yeah, it's so detailed in Bluebird. If you were to sit with Adele and have a drink in one of the speakeasies, what would your drink order be?
My drink order. Well, you know, the funniest thing is that I don't like whiskey. Isn't that terrible? I like Irish whiskey. I like Bailey's. So, you know, Bailey's on ice would work, but I'm more of a wine girl. I'm more of a Pinot Grigio kind of a girl. So she could have her whiskey sour, which I know is her favorite, but I think I'd be drinking a little wine.
I would join you with the wine. Genevieve, we could keep going. There are still questions coming in and there's still so much for us to talk about, but I just wanted to say thank you. For those of you who have mentioned that you are just diving into Bluebird, I really hope you enjoy it. I think you will all know the part where I gasped and put my book down. So I hope you think of us when you get to that point. And thank you for joining us tonight. Genevieve, thank you for coming out the week your book launched, your best-selling book, Bluebird.
I'm so happy to be here with you, Kayleigh, and out with Cambridge and all these people. I wanted to tell you one thing. I saw when people were signing in that somebody is there from Turkey. Someone from Turkey is watching. Well, here's a funny thing. I happened to see this image, that girl's image on Instagram, but it was in red. And I messaged the woman and I said, do you do book covers? And I connected with the model who had originally done that photo. And she is in Poland. And I've sent her a copy of the book and we got a nice little conversation going. I thought that was a really neat connection. Anna in Poland. So
what a small world.
Isn't that neat?
That is so cool.
Yeah, well, I feel so fortunate to do what I do. And I love being able to sit with you, Kayleigh, and with readers and talk about these things, because writing to me is it's magic. It's a gift. I love it. It fills me, and you know that from when you're writing. It fills me, and I feel very privileged. So thank you very much, and thank you so much to readers who put this book on the instant bestseller list after one day. I am blown away by that. So thank you all very much.
I think people are ready to pre-order the next book, just to let you know.
I always get that question like 2 days after they receive their book. What's next? When's it? So there will be one, spring 2023 and 2024. I guarantee it.
I think this is where we let Ronnie come back on and give her final thank yous.
Hello,
or else we'll just keep talking, Ronnie.
I know, the hour, I don't know where the hour goes, but thank you everybody. The chat room, both on Zoom and on Facebook, we're just on fire. I couldn't keep up with it. And so thank you to the audience. I have exciting news. So Genevieve actually created a list of 5 books that she recommends after you've read Bluebird. It's going to be up on our blog tomorrow morning. So if you're on Zoom, I'm going to send you the link to the blog page. If you're on Facebook, hop over to our page tomorrow. I'm going to do a post about it. Be sure to grab a copy of Bluebird wherever you are in the world. It's a fabulous book. You're going to be up all night reading it, FYI. Thank you. Please do follow us, Romance by the Book. We are going to be coming up with a fabulous events for the summer. I'm trying to remember what season we're in because it's snowing sometimes. So I don't know what season we're in, but we're actually in spring. So do keep follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our page. And we will, and if you are on Zoom, if you're watching on Zoom, I will send you a list of upcoming events as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Genevieve, for joining us, and Kayleigh for always just using, your amazing self. And thank you to the audience as well. Bye for now, everybody.
Everyone.